Hello and welcome to this wonderful place that we call Grazing Brains. Please subscribe. Stave 3. The second of the three spirits. Awakening in the middle of a prodigiously taut snore and sitting up in the bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge had no occasion to be told that the bell was going upon the strike of 1. He felt that he was restored to consciousness in the right nick of time, for the special purpose of holding a conference with the second messenger dispatched to him through Jacob Marley's intervention. But finding that he turned inconfidently cold when he began to wonder which of his curtains this new spectrum would draw back, he put them everyone aside with his own hands, and laying down again, established a sharp lookout all around the bed. For he wished to challenge the spirit on the moment of its appearance, and did not wish to be taken by surprise and made nervous. Gentlemen of the free and easy sort, who plumed themselves on being acquainted with a move or two, and began usually equal to be to the time of the day, express the wide range of their capacity for adventure by observing that they are good for anything from pitch and toss to manslaughter, between which opposite extreme, no doubt, there lies a tolerably wide and comprehensive range of subjects. Without venturing for Scrooge quite as hard as this, I don't mind calling on you to believe that he was ready for a good broad field of strange appearances, and that nothing between a baby and rhinoceros would have astonished him very much. Now, being prepared for almost anything, he was not by any means prepared for nothing, and consequently, when the bell struck 1 and no shape appeared, he was taken with a violent fit of trembling. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour went by, and yet nothing came. All this time he lay upon his bed, the very core and center of a blaze of rude light which streamed upon it when the clock proclaimed the hour, and which, being only light, was more alarming than a dozen ghosts, as he was powerless to make out what it meant, or would be at, and was something apprehensive that he might be at the very moment an interesting case of spontaneously combustion, without having the consolation of knowing it. At least, however, he began to think, as you or I would have thought at first, or it is always the person of the predicament who knows what ought to have been done in it, and would unquestionably have done it too at last. I say he began to think that the source and the secret of the ghostly light might be in the adjoining room. From one house, on further facing it, it seemed to shine. This idea taking full possession of his mind, he got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the floor. The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange voice called him by his name and bade him enter. He obeyed. It was his own room, there was no doubt about it, but it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and the ceiling were so hung with living green that it looked a perfect grove, from every part of which bright, gleaming berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoes, and ivy reflected back the light, as if so many little mirrors had been scattered there, and such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney, as that due putrefaction of a heart had never known in Scrooge's time, or Marley's, or for many and many winter seasons gone, heaped up upon the floor to form a kind of throne where turkeys, geese, games, poultry, brawn, great joint of meat, sucking pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-chicken apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense 12 cakes, and sitting bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. In easy state upon this couch there sat a jolly giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch in a shape that, unlike Plenty's horn, it held high up to shed its light on Scrooge as he came peeping around the door. "Come in!" exclaimed the ghost. "Come in, and know me better, man." Scrooge entered timidly and hung his head before the spirits. He was not the Dutch Scrooge he had been, and though its eyes were clear and kind, he did not like to meet them. "I am am the ghost of Christmas present," said the spirit. "Look upon me." Scrooge reverently did so. It was clothed on a simple deep green robe or mantle, bordered with white fur. This garment hung so loosely on the figure that its capacious breasts were bare, as if disdaining to be warded or concealed by any artifices. Its feet, observably beneath the ample folds of the garment, were also bare. On its head it wore no other covering than a holy wreath set here and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free as the genial face, its sparkling eyes, its open hand, its cheery voice, its unconstrained demeanor, and its joyful air. Girded around its middle was an antique scabbard, but no sword was in it, and an ancient shed was eaten up with rust. "You haven't never seen the like of me before," exclaimed the spirit. "Never," Scrooge made answer to it. "Have never walked forth with the younger members of my family, meaning, for I am very young, my older brother born in these late years," pursued the phantom. "I don't think I have," said Scrooge. "I am afraid I have not. Have you had many brothers, spirit?" "More than 1800, said the ghost. "A tremendous family to provide for," muttered Scrooge. The ghost of the Christmas present rose. "Spirit," said Scrooge submissively, "conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion, and I learned a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it. Touch my robe." Scrooge did as he was told, and held it fast. Holly, mistletoes, red berries, ivy, turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brown, meat, pigs, sausages, oysters, pies, puddings, fruit, and punch all vanished instantly. So did the room, the fire, the ruddy glow, the hour of night, and they stood in the city street on Christmas morning, where, for the weather was severe, the people made it raw, but brisk and unpleasant kind of music, in scraping the snow from the pavement in front of their dwellings and from the top of their houses. Hence it was mad delight to the boys to see it come plumping down in the road below and splitting into artificial little snowstorms. The house fronts looked black enough, and the windows blacker, constraining with the smooth white sheets of snow upon the roofs, and with the dirtier snow upon the ground, which last deposit had been plunged up the deep furrows by the heavy wheels of carts and wagons, furrows that crossed and recrossed each other hundreds of times where the great street branched off and made intricate channels hard to trace in the thick yellow mud and icy water. The sky was gloomy, and the shortest streets were choked up with dingy mist, half twelfth, half frozen, whose heavier particles descended in a shower of sooty atoms, as if all the chimneys in Great Britain had by one consent caught fire and were breathing away to their dear hearts' content. There was nothing very cheerful in the climate or the town, and yet there was an air of cheerfulness abroad that the clearest summer air and the brightest summer sun might have endeavored to diffuse in vain. For the people who were travelling away in the housetops were joyful and full of glee, calling out to one another from the parapets, and now and then exchanging affectitious snowballs, better-natured missiles, or then many a wordy jet, flouting heartily if it went right, and not less hardly if it went wrong. The poulterers' shops were still half open, and the fruiterers were radiant in their glory. There was a great, round, pot-belled basket of chestnut, shaped like the waistcoat of jolly old gentlemen, lolling at the door and tumbling out in the street in their opulence. There were ruddy, brown-faced, broad-girted Spanish onions, shining in the fatness of their growth like Spanish friars, and winking from their shelves in wanton silliness of the girls as they went by and glanced demurely at the hanging-up mistletoes. There were pears and apples, clustered high in blooming pyramids. There were bunches of grapes, made in the shopkeeper's benevolence to dangle from the conspicuous hooks, that people's mouths might water gratis as they passed. There were piles of filberts, mossy and brown, recalling in their fragrance ancient walks among the woods and pleasant shuffling ankle-deep through withered leaves. there were Norfolk biffins and swartly, sitting off the yellow of the oranges and lemons in their great compactness of their juicy persons, urgently entertaining and beseeching to be carried home in paper bags and eaten after dinner. There were gold and silver fishes set forth among the choice fruits in the bowls, though members of a due and stagnant-blooded race appeared to know that there was something going on, and to a fish went grasping around and around their little swirl in slow and passionate excitement. The groceress, oh, the groceress, near closed with perhaps 2 shutters down, or 1, but through those gaped such glances. It was not alone that the scale descending on the counters made a merry sound, or that the twine and roller parted company so briskly, or that the canister were rattled up and down like juggling tricks, or even that the blended scents of tea and coffee were so grateful to the nose, or even that the raisins were so plentiful and rare, and the almonds so extremely white, the sticks of cinnamon so long and straight, the other spices so delicious, the candied fruits so caked and spotted with molten sugar as to make the coldest looker on feel pain, and subsequently bilious. Nor was it that the figs were moist and pulpy, or that the French plums brushed the modest tartness from their highly decorated boxes, or that everything was good to eat and in its Christmas dress, but the customers were all so hurried and so eager in the hopeful promise of the day that they trembled up against each other at the door, clashing their wicker baskets widely, and left their purchases upon the counter, and came running back to fetch them, and committed hundreds of the like mistakes in the best humor possible, while the grocer and his people were so frank and fresh that the polished hearts with which they fastened their aprons behind might have been there worn outside of general inspection, and for Christmas dough to pack after they were trolls. But soon the Staples called good people all to church and chapels, and away they came, flocking through the streets in their best clothes with their gayest faces, and at the same time they emerged from score of by-street, lane and nameless turnings, innumerable people carrying their dinners to the baker's shop. The sight of these poor revelers appeared to interest the spirit very much, for he sprinkled incense on their dinners from his torch, and it was very uncommon kind of torch, for once or twice when there were angry words between some diner carriers who had jostled with each other, he shed a few drops of water on them from it, and their good humor was restored directly, for they said it was a shame to quarrel upon Christmas Day, so it was. God love it, so it was. In time the bell ceased, and the bakers were shut up, and yet there was a genuine shadowing forth all these dinners and the progress of their cooking, in the towelled blotch of wet above each baker's oven, where the pavement smoked as if it was stone were cooking too. Is there particular flavor in what you sprinkle from your torch? Asked Scrooge. There is, my own. Would it apply to any kind of dinner at this day? Asked Scrooge. To any kindly given, to a poor one most. Why to a poor one most? Asked Scrooge. Because it needs it most. Spirit, said Scrooge after a moment's thought, I wonder you, of all the beings in the many worlds about us, should desire to cramp these people opportunities of innocent enjoyment. Aye, cried the Spirit, you would deprive them of their means of dining every 7th day, often the only day in which they can be said to dine at all, said Scrooge. Wouldn't you? Aye, cried the Spirit. You seek to close these places on the 7th day, said Scrooge. And it comes to the same thing. I see, explained the Spirit. And it comes to the same thing. I see, exclaimed the Spirit. Forgive me if I'm wrong. It has been done in your name, or at least in that of your family, said Scrooge. There are some upon this earth of yours, returned the Spirit, who lay down to know us, and who do their deeds of passion, pride, ill will, hatred, envy, bigotry, and selfishness in our name, who are strange to us and all our kinds and kind, as if they had never lived. Remember that, and charge their doings on themselves, not us. Scrooge promised that he would, and they went on invisible, as they had been before, into the suburbs of the town. It was a remarkable quality of the ghost, which Scrooge had observed at the baker's, that notwithstanding his gazing size, he could accommodate himself to any place with ease, and that he stood beneath a low roof quite as graceful and like a supernatural creature as it was possible he could have done in any lofty hall. And perhaps it was the pleasure the good spirit had in showing off this power of his, or else it was his own kind, generous, hearty nature and his sympathy with all poor men that led him straight to Scrooge's clerks. For there he went and took Scrooge with him, holding to his robe, and on the threshold of the door the spirit smiled and stopped to bless Bob's crotchets, dwelling with the sparkling of his torch. Think of that! Bob had but 15 a week himself. He poked on Saturdays by 15 copies of his Christian name, and yet the ghost of Christmas present blessed the 4-room house. Then uprose Mrs. Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in twistern gown, but brave in ribbons, which are cheap and make goodly show of sixpence, and she laid the clothes, assisted by the Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, who brave in Robinson, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into a saucepan potatoes, and getting the corners of his monstrous shirt collar, Bob's private property, conferred upon his son in honor of the day, into his mouth, rejoiced to find himself so gallantly attired, and yearned to show his linen and fashionable bark. And now the 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and a girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelled a goose and know if it's their own, and basking in luxury thoughts of sage and onion. These young Cratchits danced about the table and exhaled Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he, not proud, although his collar nearly choked him, blew the fire until the slow potatoes bubbling up knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled. "What had ever got your precious father then?" said Mrs. Cratchit. "And your brother, Tiny Tim and Martha, weren't as late last Christmas Day by half an hour." "Here is Martha, mother," said the girl, appearing as she spoke. "Here is Martha, mother," cried the 2 young Cratchits. "Hooray! There is such a goose, Martha." "Why, bless your hearts alive, my dear, how late you are!" Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times and taking off her shawl and bonnet for her with officious zeal. "We had a deal of work to finish up last night," replied the girl, "and had to clear away this morning, mother." "Well, never mind, as long as you're come," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Sit you all down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm, Lord bless you." No, there is father coming," cried the 2 young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. "Hide, Martha, hide!" So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob, the father, with the last 3 feet of comfortable exclusive of the fringe hanging down before him, in his threadbare clothes turned up and brushed, to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas, for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and he had his lump supported by an iron rein. "Not coming," said Bob, with a sudden declination in his high spirit, for he had been Tim's blood horse all the way from church and had come home rampant. "Not coming upon Christmas Day." Martha didn't like to see him disappointed if it were only a joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and running into his arms, while the 2 young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash-house, that he might hear the pudding singing into the copper. "And how did the little Timmy behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit, when she had riled Bob on his credulity. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much, and thinking the strangest thing you ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was crippled, and it might be pleasant to them to remember, upon Christmas Day, who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." Bob's voice was tremulous when he told this tale, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Timmy was growing stronger and hearty. His active little crutch was hard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Timmy before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool beside the fire. And while Bob, turning up his cuff as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, Compound some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemon and stir it around and put it in the hob to simmer. Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young creatures went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high possession. Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose the rarest of all birds, the feathered phenomenon, to which a black swan was a matter of course, and in truth it was something very like in that house. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner at the table. The two young creatures set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and mounted guard upon their posts, crammed spoons in their mouths, lest their shout shriek of goose before their turn came to be helped. At last the dishes were set on, and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it in the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stiffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all around the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young creatures, beat on the table with the handle of his knife, and feebly cried, "Hooray!" There was never such a goose, but Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness were all the themes of the universal admiration, echoed out by the applesauce and mashed potato. It was sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit, with a great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, they hadn't ate it all at last. Yet everyone had enough, and the youngest creature in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witness, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody should have got over the wall of the backyard and stolen it while they were merry with the goose. A suspicion at which the two young creatures became livid. All sorts of horror were supposed. How a great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the cupboard. It smelled like washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like a eating house, and pastry cooks next door into each other, with a laundress next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed with smiling proudly, with the pudding like a peckled cannon ball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quarter of ignited brandy, and bednight with a Christmas holly stuck into the top. Oh, a wonderful pudding! Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said now the weight was off her mind. She would confess she had had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said it or thought it was at all small pudding for a large family. It would have been a flat heresy to do so. Any creature would have blushed to hint at such a thing. At last the dinner was all done. The cloth was clean, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovel full of chestnut on the fire. The non-Cratchit family drew around the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half a one, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family displaying a flask, 2 tumblers, and a custard cup without a handle. This held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as a gold goblet would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming look, while the chestnut on the fire sputtered and cracked noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to all, my dears. God bless us," which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, everyone," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his witchered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge with an interest he had never held before, "tell me if the Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "No, no," said Scrooge. "Oh no, kind spirit, say he will be spared. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race," returned the ghost, "will find him here. What then? If he be like to die, he had better to do it, and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words uttered by the spirit, and was overcome with penitence and grief. "Man," said the ghost, "if man you be in heart, not a dominant, forbear that wicked cant until you have discovered what the surplus is and where it is. You will decide what man should live, what man should die. It may be that in the sight of heaven we are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. To hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on the too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust." Scrooge bent before Ghost Rebuck, and trembling cast eyes upon the ground, but he raised them speedily on hearing his own name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob, "I will give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast indeed." "Founder of the feast indeed," cried Mrs. Cratchit. "I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have good appetite for it." "My dear," said Bob, "the children, Christmas Day." "It should be Christmas Day, I'm sure," said she, "on which one drinks and healths of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you, poor fellow." "My dear," was Bob's mild answer, "I will drink his health for your sake and the day's," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not for his. Long life to him, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He will be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt." The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceeding which had no heartiness in it. Tiny Tim drank at last of all, but he didn't care twopence for it. Scrooge was an ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before, from their mere relief of Scrooge the baleful being done with. Bob Cratchit told them how he had a situation in his eye for Mr. Peter, which would bring it, if obtained, full 5 and 6 pence weekly. The two young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Peter's being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire from between his collar, as he were deliberating with particular investment he should favour when he came onto the receipt of that bewildering income. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at the milliner's, then told them what kind of work she had to do, and how many hours she worked at a stretch, and how she meant to lie abed tomorrow morning for a good long rest. Tomorrow, being a holiday, she passed at home. Also how she had been accomplice of a lord some days before, and how the lord was much about as tall as Peter, at which Peter pulled up his collar so high that you couldn't have seen his head if you had been there. All this time the chestnut and the jug went around, and by they had a song about a lost child traveling in the snow, from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice and sang it very well indeed. There was nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty, and Peter might have known, and very likely he did, the inside of pawnbrokers. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and content with the time. And when they faded, and looking happier yet in the bright sprinkling of the Spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eyes upon them, and specially upon Tiny Tim, until the last. By the time it was getting dark and snowing pretty heavily, and as Scrooge and the Spirit went along the street, the brightness of the roaring fire in the kitchen's parlours, in all sorts of rooms, was wonderful. Here the flickering of the blaze showed preparation of a cozy dinner, with hot plates baking through and through before the fire, and curtains ready to be drawn to shut out cold and darkness. There all the children of the house were running out into the snow to meet their married sisters, brothers, cousins, uncles, aunts, and be the first to greet them. Here again were shadows on the windows blind of guests assembling, and there a group of handsome girls, all hooked and fur-booted, and all chattering at once, tripping lights of to some near neighbor's house, whereupon the single man who saw them enter artful witches. Well, they knew it in a gloom. But if you had judged them from the number of people on their way to friendly gatherings, you might have thought that no one was at home to give them welcome when they got there. Instead of every house expected company and pulling up its fires chimney high. Blessings on how the ghost exulted, how it bared its breadths of breast and opened its conspicuous palm and floated on, outpouring with a generous hand its bright and harmless mirth on everything within its reach. The very lamplighter, who ran on before dotting the sky streak with speck of light, and who was dressed to spend the evening somewhere, laughed out loudly as the spirit passed. Though little Kenneth, the lamplighter, that he had any company but Christmas. And now, without a word of warning from the ghost, they stood upon a bleak of desert moor, where monstrous mouses of rude stone were cast about, as though it were the burial place of a giant, and water spread itself wheresoever it listed, or would have done so but for the frost that held in prisoner, and nothing grew but moss and furze and coarse rank grass. Down in the west of the setting sun had left a thick fiery red, which glared on the desolation for an instant, like a sullen eye, and frowning lower yet, was lost in the thick gloom of the darkest night. What place is this? A place where miners live who labor in the bowels of the earth, returned the spirit. But they know me. See? A light stone from the window of a hut, and swiftly they advanced toward it. Passing through the wall of mud and stone, they found a cheerful company assembled around the glowing fire, an old man and woman, with their children and their children's children, and another generation beyond that, all decked out gaily in their holiday attire. The old man, in a voice that seldom rose above the howlings of the wind upon the barren waste, was singing them a Christmas song. It had been a very old song when he was a boy, and from time to time they all joined in the choir. So surely as they raised their voices, the old man got quite bitter and loud, and so surely as they stopped, his figure sung again. The spirit did not tarry here, but bade Scrooge hold his rope, and passing on above the moor, sped with her. Not to see, to see. To Scrooge's horror, looking back, he saw the last of the land, frightful range of rocks behind them, and his ears were deafened by the thundering as it rolled and roared and raged among the dreadful caverns it had worn, and peacefully tried to undermine the earth. Built upon a dismaying reef of sinking rocks, some leg or so from shore, on which the water chafed and dashed the wild year through, there stood a solitary lighthouse. Great heaps of seaweed clung to its base, and storm birds, born of the wind one might suppose, a seaweed of the water, rose and held about it like the waves they skimmed. But even here 2 men who watched the light had made a fire that, though the loophole in the thick stone wall shed out a ray of brightness on the awful sea. Joining their hands over the wrought table at which they sat, they wished each other Merry Christmas in their can of grog, and one of them, the elder two, with his face all damaged and scarred with the hard weather, as the figurehead of an old ship might be, struck up a sturdily song that was like a gale in itself. Again the ghost sped on above the heaving sea, on until being far away as he could, as he thought Scrooge, from any shore, they lighted up on a ship. They stood beside the helmsman on the wheel, the lookout in the bow, the officer who had the watch, dark ghostly figures in their several stations, but every man among them hummed in Christmas tune, or had a Christmas thought, or spoke below his breath to his companion of some bygone Christmas day, with homeward hopes of belonging to it. And every man on board walking or sleeping, good or bad, had a kinder word for another on that day than on any other day in the year, and had shared to some extent in its festivities, and had remembered those he carried forth at distance, and had known that they delight to remember him. It was a great surprise for Scrooge, while listening to the moaning of the wind and thinking what soul men think it was to move through the lonely darkness over an unknown abyss, whose depths were secrets as profound as death. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while thus engaged, to hear a heartily vow. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gloomy room with the Spirit standing smiling by his side, and looking at the same nephew with approving affability. "Ha, ha!" laughed Scrooge's nephew. "Ha, ha, ha! If you should happen by any unlike chance to know a man more blessed in a laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is I should like to know him too. Introduce him to me, and I will cultivate his acquaintance. It is a far, even-handed, noble adjustment of things, that while there is infection and disease and sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistible contagious as love and good humor." When Scrooge's nephew laughed in this way, holding his side, rolling his head, and twisting his face into the most extravagant contortions, Scrooge's niece by marriage laughed as hardly as he, as they assembled, friends being not a bit behindhand, roaring out lustily, "Ha, ha, 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 ha! He said that Christmas was humbug, as I live," cried Scrooge's nephew. "He believed it too." "More shame for him, Fred," said Scrooge's niece indignantly. "Bless those women. They never do anything by half. They are always in earnest." She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised-looking capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, and no doubt it was, all kind of good little dots about her chin that melted into another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in any little creature's head. Altogether she was what you would have called provoking, you know, but satisfactory too, or perfectly satisfactory. "He is a comical old fellow," said Scrooge's nephew. "That's the truth. Not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offences carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him." "I'm sure he is very rich," Fred, said Scrooge's niece. "At least you always tell me so." "What of that, my dear?" said Scrooge's nephew. "His wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. He doesn't do satisfaction of thinking, ha ha ha, and that he is ever going to benefit us with it. I have no patience with him," observed niece. Scrooge's sister and all the other ladies expressed the same opinion. "Oh, I have," said Scrooge's nephew. "I'm sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his own whims, himself always. Here he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What is the consequences? He'd lose much of the dinner." "Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner," interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges, because they had just had dinner, and with a dessert upon the table, were clustered around the fire by lamplight. "Well, I am very glad to hear it," said Scrooge's nephew, "because I haven't any great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper?" Topper had clearly got his eye upon one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered, a bachelor was a wretched outcast, who had no right to express an opinion on the subject. Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed. "Do go on, Fred," said Scrooge's niece, clapping her hand. "He never finished what he's being to say. He is such a ridiculous fellow." Scrooge's nephew revealed another laugh, as it was impossible to keep the infection off. The plump sister tried hard to do it with a romantic vinegar. His example was anonymously followed. "I was only going to say," said Scrooge's nephew, "that the consequence of his thinking a dislike to us and not making merry with us is, I think, that he loses some pleasant moments companions which could do him no harm. I'm sure he loses pleasant companions that he can find in his own thoughts, either in his mouldy old office or his dusty chambers. I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he like or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him if he finds me going there in a good temper year after year and saying, "Uncle Scrooge, how are you?" If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something, and I think I shook him yesterday. It was their turn to laugh now at the notion of his shaking Scrooge, but being thoroughly good-natured and not much caring with what they laughed at, so that they laughed at any rate, he encouraged them in their merriment, passed the bottle joyously. After tea, had some music, for they were a musical family, and knew what they were about when they sang a glee or cat, I can assure you, especially Topper, who could grow away in the bass like a good one, and never swell the large vein in his forehead, or get red in the face over it. Scrooge's nephew played well upon the harp, and played among other tunes in a simple little air, a mere nothing we might learn to whistle in 2 minutes, which had been familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from the boarding school, as he had been reminded by the ghost of the Christmas past. When this strain of music sounded, all the things that ghost had shown him came upon his mind. He softened it more and more, and thought that if he could have listened it often years ago, he might have cultivated the kindness of life for his own happiness with his own hand, without resorting to the sexton's spade that buried Jacob Marley. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while they played at forfeit, for it's a good to be children sometimes, and never better than at Christmas, when it might founder was a child himself. There was a first game at Blindsman's Booth. Of course there was, and I no more believe Topper was a real blind then. I believe he had eyes on his boots. My opinion is that it was a done thing between him and Scrooge's nephew, and that the ghost of the Christmas present knew it. The way he went after the plump sister in the lace tucker was an outrage of the credulity of human nature. Knocking down the fire irons, tumbling over the chairs, bumping up against the piano, smoothing himself among the curtains. Wherever she went, there went he. He always knew where the plump sister was. He wouldn't catch anybody else. If you had fallen up against him, as some of them did, he stood there. He would have made a feint of endeavoring to seize you, which would have been an affront to your understanding, and would instantly have side-slid off in the direction of the plump sister. She often cried out that it wasn't fair, and it was really not, but when at least he caught her, when in spite of all her silky rustling and her rapid fluttering past him, he got her into a corner's hands, there was no space. Then his conduct was the most execrable. For his pretending not to know her, his pretending that it was unnecessary to touch her headdress, and further to assume himself of her identity by pressing a certain ring upon her finger and a certain chain about her neck, was vile, monstrous. No doubt she told him her opinion of it, when, another blind man being in office, they were so very confidential together behind the curtains. Scrooge's niece was not one of the blind man's buffer party, but was made comfortable with a large chair and a footstool in a snug corner where the ghost and Scrooge were close behind her. But she joined the forfeit and loved her love to Narration with all the letters of the alphabet. Likewise, all the game of how, when, and where. She was very great, and to the secret joys of Scrooge's nephew beat her sister hollow, though they were sharp girls too, as Topper could have told you. There might have been plenty of people there, young and old, but they all played, and so did Scrooge, for wholly forgetting in interest he had in what was going on, that his voice made no sound in their ears. He sometimes came out with his guesses quite loud, and very often guesses right too, for the sharpest needle, best Whitechapel, warrant not to cut in the eye, was not sharper than Scrooge, blunt as he took it in his head to be. The ghost was gently pleased to find him in this mood, and looked upon him with such favour. He begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guest departed, but the spirit said could not be done. "Here is a new game," said Scrooge. "1 half-hour, spirit, only one." It was a game called Yes or No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think something and the rest might find out what, he only answering to their question yes or no, as the case was. The brisky fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, rather a disgraceful animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, and talked sometimes, and lived in London, and walked about the street, and wasn't made a show of, and wasn't led anybody, and didn't like in a menagerie, and was never killed in the market, and was not a horse, or an ass, or a cow, or a bull, or a tiger, or a dog, or a pig, or a cat, or a bear. And at every fresh question that was put to him, this nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter, and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get off the sofa and stand. At last the plump sister, falling into a similar state, cried out, I found it out! I know what it is, Fred! I know what it is! What is it? Cried Fred. It is your Uncle Scrooge! Which it certainly was. The admiration was the universal sentiment, though some opted rarely to "Is it a bear?" ought to have been, and much as an answer in the negative was sufficient to have diverted their thoughts from Mr. Scrooge, supposing they had ever had any tendency that way. He had given us plenty of merriment, I'm sure, said Fred, and it would be ungrateful not to drink his health. Here is a glass of malted wine ready for our hand at the moment, and I say, Uncle Scrooge. Well, Uncle Scrooge, they cried. A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man, wherever he is, said Scrooge's nephew. He wouldn't take it from me, but he had it, nevertheless. Uncle Scrooge. Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart that he would have plunged the unconscious company in return and taking them into undoubtable speech if the ghost had given him time. But the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last words spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirits were again upon their travels. Much they saw, and far they went, and many homes they visit, but always with happy end. The spirits stood beside the sick bed, and they were cheerful. On foreign lands they were close at home by struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope by poverty, and it was rich. An almshouse, hospital, and jail, in miseries the every refuge. When vain man in his little brief authority had not made fast the door and bare the spirit out, he left his blessing at old Scrooge his receipt. It was a long night, if it were only a night, but Scrooge had his doubt of this, because the Christmas holidays appeared to be condensed into a space of time they passed together. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outer form, the ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge has observed this change, but never speak of it, until they left the children's 12th night party. When looked at the spirit as they stood together in an open space, he noticed that its hair was grey. Are spirits' lives so short? asked Scrooge. My life upon this globe is very brief, replied the ghost. It ends tonight. Tonight? Cried Scrooge. Tonight, in midnight. This time is drawing near. The chimneys were ringing the 11:15 at the moment. Forgive me if I am not justified in what I ask, said Scrooge, looking intently to the spirit's robe, but I see something strange and not belonging to yourself protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw? It might be a claw, for the flesh there is upon it, but the spirit's sorrow replied, Look here. From the folding of its robe it brought 2 children, wretched subject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They kneeled down at its feet, and clunging upon the outside of the garment. Oh man, look here, look down here, exclaimed the ghost. They were a boy and a girl, yellow, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate too in their humility. They were graceful. Youth should have filled their future out and touched them with its fresh tin. A still and shriveling hand like that of age had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into a shred. Where angels might have sat and drawn, devil lurked and glared at menacing. No chance, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grave through all the mysteries of the wonderful creation, and has monsters half so horrible and dread. Scrooge started back, appalled. Having them shown to him in this way, he tried to say they were fine children, but the words choked him themselves rather than two parties of lies of such enormous magnitude. Spirit, are they yours? Scrooge could say no more. They are men's, said Spirit, looking down upon them, and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Be aware, them both, and all of their degree, but most of all be aware this boy, for on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless the writing be erased. Deny it, cried the Spirit, stretching out his hand towards the city. Slander those who tell it. Admit it for your factious purpose, and make it worse, and bide the end. Have they no refuge or resource? Cried Scrooge. Are there no prisons? Said the Spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. Are there no workhouses? The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost and saw it not. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of the old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eye, beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground toward him. This is the end of today's story. I hope that these past minutes helped you relax and ease you in falling asleep. If you are not 100% there yet, let us just do a breathing exercise. Count mentally with me your breath intakes and exhales. Concentrate on the count, nothing more. Intake 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and release 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. In 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Out 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Intake 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and release 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. In 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Out 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Intake 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and release 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. In 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Out 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Intake 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and release 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. In 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Out 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. In 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Out 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1,